The moment my daughter-in-law Chloe handed me that handwritten invoice demanding $300 for monthly accommodation fees in my own kitchen, I knew something had shifted forever in the house where I'd raised my children and buried my husband. She stood there with her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the granite countertop I'd saved 2 years to afford, smiling that thin smile she reserved for when she thought she'd won something. My son Marcus just sat at the breakfast table scrolling through his phone like his mother wasn't being charged rent to live in her own home. That was the moment I realized I'd been too quiet for too long, and they were about to learn exactly what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like every other Tuesday since Marcus and Chloe moved back into my house 6 months ago. I was up at 5:30 brewing coffee in the machine Gerald bought me for our 25th anniversary, the one with the timer that still worked perfectly even though he'd been gone 3 years now. The kitchen was my sanctuary in those early hours before the house woke up, before Chloe's voice cut through the air with demands and Marcus's silence filled the spaces where his father's laughter used to live. I'd been making scrambled eggs when I heard her heels clicking down the hardwood stairs, each step deliberate and sharp like she was announcing her arrival to subjects rather than family. Chloe appeared in the doorway wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her blonde hair pulled back in that severe bun she favored when she meant business. She was 28 but carried herself like someone who'd been managing boardrooms for decades, which I suppose she had been since graduating business school and landing that position at her father's investment firm. "Good morning, Velma," she said, my name coming out flat and professional like I was the hired help. She never called me Mom, not even when she and Marcus got engaged. Always Velma, always with that slight pause before it like she was reminding herself to be polite. I turned from the stove and offered her a plate. "Morning, honey. Eggs?" She wrinkled her nose the way she always did when I offered her anything I'd cooked, like my food might contaminate her carefully curated lifestyle. "I don't eat eggs. Too much cholesterol." She opened the refrigerator and pulled out one of those expensive green smoothies that cost $8 each and tasted like grass clippings. "Besides, we need to talk about the living situation here." "Something in?" Her tone made my stomach tighten. I'd heard that voice before in the months since they'd moved in, usually right before she announced some new rule about the house or some change she wanted to make to rooms I'd decorated with Gerald's help over 30 years of marriage. Last month it was the living room furniture she deemed dated. The month before that, she'd convinced Marcus they needed to repaint the master bedroom because the blue walls I'd chosen reminded her of a nursing home. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my hands had started to shake slightly. I set the spatula down and turned to face her fully, something I'd learned to do when Gerald was alive. He always said you could tell when someone was about to deliver bad news by the way they avoided eye contact. Chloe took a long sip of her smoothie, making me wait. It was a power move, one I recognized from my years working as an administrative assistant at the law firm before Gerald's insurance money allowed me to retire early. "Well, Marcus and I have been talking, and we think it's time we formalized our arrangement here." "Formalized how?" The eggs were starting to burn behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away from her face. Something was coming, something bigger than paint colors or furniture arrangements. She reached into her leather handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, cream-colored stationery with her initials embossed at the top in gold. "We've drawn up a little agreement. Nothing too complicated, just outlining everyone's responsibilities. Now that we're all sharing the space." I took the paper with fingers that felt suddenly clumsy and unfolded it slowly. At the top, written in Chloe's precise handwriting, were the words, "Household Financial Contribution Agreement." Below that, a list of items that made my vision blur around the edges. Monthly accommodation fee for Velma Stone, $300. Utility contribution, $50. Kitchen usage fee, $25. The list went on, itemizing every aspect of living in what had been my home for over 3 decades. "Kitchen usage fee?" I heard myself say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. "This is my house, Chloe." She straightened, and I caught a flicker of something cold behind her perfectly applied makeup. "Actually, Velma, if you look at the deed, you'll see that Marcus is listed as co-owner. His father put the house in both their names when Marcus turned 21. Very forward-thinking of Gerald, really. And since Marcus and I are married, that makes me a co-owner as well." The kitchen tilted slightly, like I was standing on the deck of a boat in rough water. "That's not." Gerald would have told me. If he'd done something like that. Chloe's smile widened, showing teeth so white they looked artificial. "Oh, but he did. We found the paperwork when we were going through Marcus's father's filing cabinet last month. Right there in black and white." Marcus owns half this house, which means we have every right to establish some ground rules for how it's managed. I looked past her to where Marcus was sitting at the breakfast table, still staring at his phone like this conversation wasn't happening 10 feet away from him. Marcus? I called to him, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Is this true? He finally looked up, but only briefly before his eyes slid away from mine. Mom, we just think it would be better if everything was more official. You know, clear expectations and all that. Clear expectations? I repeated, feeling heat rise in my chest like steam from a kettle. You want me to pay rent to live in the house where I changed your diapers and nursed you through pneumonia when you were 7? Chloe stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of her perfume, something expensive and sharp that always made my nose itch. Velma, this isn't personal. It's just practical. We're all adults here, and adults pay their fair share. You'll still have your room, of course, and access to common areas during designated hours. Designated hours? The words came out as barely a whisper. Well, Marcus and I are young professionals. We need space to entertain clients, host dinner parties. You understand. She glanced around the kitchen with the air of someone surveying property they'd just purchased. We're thinking the living room and dining room would be off limits to you on weekends, and perhaps we could establish some quiet hours in the evenings. Nothing unreasonable. I set the paper down on the counter with hands that were definitely shaking now. The eggs behind me were definitely burning, filling the air with the acrid smell of ruined food, but I couldn't seem to make myself care. This woman was standing in my kitchen, wearing clothes that cost more than my monthly social security check, telling me I needed permission to use my own living room. And if I don't sign this? I asked. Chloe exchanged a look with Marcus, one of those married couple communications that happened without words. Well, that would be unfortunate. Marcus really doesn't want to have to choose between his wife and his mother, but if you're going to be difficult about reasonable boundaries. She let the threat hang in the air like smoke. I looked at my son again, this man I'd carried for 9 months and loved for 32 years, waiting for him to say something, anything, that sounded like the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Instead, he just shrugged and went back to his phone. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Chloe said, her voice bright with false understanding. Take all the time you need. We'll just need the first month's payment by Friday so we can get everything set up properly. She tucked the paper under the sugar bowl like she was leaving a tip at a restaurant and clicked back out of the kitchen, calling over her shoulder that she'd be working late and not to wait dinner for her. Marcus followed without a word, leaving me alone with the smell of burnt eggs and the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I stood there for a long time after they left, staring at that piece of paper like it might change if I looked at it hard enough. $300 for the privilege of sleeping in the bedroom where Gerald and I had shared 30 years of whispered conversations and Sunday morning coffee. $25 to use the kitchen where I'd taught Marcus to make pancakes when he was 8 years old. $50 for utilities in the house where I'd been paying electric bills since before Chloe was born. The house felt different around me suddenly, like the walls had shifted when I wasn't looking. The family photos on the refrigerator seemed to mock me, all those pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and graduation days when Marcus still looked at me like I hung the moon. Now I was apparently a tenant in my own life, a boarder in the place where I'd built every memory that mattered. I turned off the burner and scraped the ruined eggs into the garbage disposal, watching the yellow mess disappear down the drain. Like my sense of security. The paper sat on the counter where Chloe had left it, her elegant handwriting spelling out my new reality in terms that couldn't be misunderstood. I was no longer the mother, the homeowner, the woman who'd sacrificed to keep this place running when Gerald's medical bills threatened to drown us. I was now, apparently, a problem to be managed. But as I stood there in the kitchen that still smelled like burnt breakfast and broken trust, something Gerald used to say came back to me with startling clarity. He'd been a patient man, slow to anger but fierce when pushed too far, and whenever someone underestimated him at work or tried to take advantage of his quiet nature, he'd smile that particular smile and say, "Honey, some people mistake kindness for weakness. Those people always learn the difference eventually." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the drawer where I kept important documents, right next to the actual deed to the house that Gerald and I had paid off 5 years before he died. The deed with my name on it, alone, just like it had been since the day we signed the mortgage in 1994. Because whatever Chloe thought she'd found in Marcus's father's filing cabinet, whatever story she was telling herself about co-ownership and ground rules, she was about to learn something very important about the difference between confidence and facts. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table where my husband had read the newspaper every morning for 3 decades, where my son had done homework and eaten countless bowls of cereal, where I'd signed birthday cards and paid bills and planned family vacations to beaches that seemed impossibly far away back then. The morning light streamed through the window above the sink, hitting the small crystal Gerald had hung there on our first Christmas in the house. It cast tiny rainbows across the wall, the same rainbows that had fascinated Marcus when he was little enough to believe in magic. I was still looking at those rainbows when I heard Chloe's car pull out of the driveway, her BMW purring like a satisfied cat as she headed off to whatever important business required her to wear suits that cost more than most people's rent. Marcus had left 20 minutes earlier in his truck, probably headed to the construction site where he'd been working since the economy forced him to abandon his dreams of opening his own architectural firm. Neither of them had said goodbye. The silence that followed felt different than the comfortable quiet I'd grown used to in the years since Gerald's death. This was charged somehow, electric with possibility and danger in equal measure. I had until Friday to decide whether I was going to pay $300 to live in my own house or find out what happened when I refused to play along with Chloe's version of reality. I thought about calling my sister Ruth, who'd been telling me for months that Chloe was trouble with a capital T and Marcus was too blind to see it. Ruth had never been one to hold back her opinions, especially about family matters, and she'd made it clear that she thought I was being a doormat to my own son and his wife. But pride kept me from reaching for the phone. This was my family, my house, my problem to solve. Instead, I did what I always did when I needed to think clearly. I went upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Gerald and opened the closet where I kept his things, clothes I couldn't bring myself to donate and papers I'd never quite finished sorting through. In the back, behind a box of his old ties and the suit he'd worn to Marcus's high school graduation, was a metal filing box I'd forgotten about until this moment. Gerald had been meticulous about paperwork, the kind of man who kept receipts for everything and filed documents in labeled folders with the precision of a librarian. After he died, I'd been too overwhelmed with grief and medical bills to go through everything properly. I'd boxed up what looked important and dealt with the immediate necessities, but there were whole sections of his record-keeping that I'd never explored. I pulled the box out and set it on the bed, my hands trembling slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside were folders organized by year, going back to when we'd first bought the house. Mortgage papers, insurance documents, tax returns, home improvement receipts. But there, near the bottom, was a folder labeled Legal Documents in Gerald's careful handwriting. Inside that folder was our will, updated just 2 years before Gerald's death when his doctor first mentioned the word cancer. Below that were power of attorney forms, medical directives, and then, at the very bottom, a copy of something that made my breath catch in my throat. A quitclaim deed, dated 3 years ago, transferring Gerald's half of the house to me and me alone, signed and notarized and filed with the county clerk's office a full month before he died. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the paper shaking in my hands as I read it again to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Gerald had made sure that when he died, I would be the sole owner of our home. Not Marcus, not anyone else. Just me. Which meant that whatever Chloe thought she'd found in that filing cabinet, whatever story she was telling about co-ownership and legal rights, was based on information that was either outdated or flat out wrong. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep in my chest, not because anything was funny but because the relief was so overwhelming it had to come out somehow. Gerald had protected me even from the grave, had made sure that no matter what happened after he was gone, I would never be homeless in my own life. He'd known, somehow, that this day might come, that Marcus might need to be reminded who owned what and who owed him respect. I held the deed against my chest and let myself feel the full weight of what Chloe had tried to do. She'd attempted to turn me into a tenant in my own home, to charge me rent for sleeping in the bed where my husband had died, to make me pay for the privilege of cooking meals in the kitchen where I'd fed my family for 30 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd counted on my ignorance, my grief, my reluctance to fight with the son I'd raised to be better than this. But grief, I was learning, could also be a teacher. It had taught me that loss was inevitable but dignity was a choice. It had shown me that being alone didn't mean being powerless, that quiet didn't mean weak. And now it was about to teach Chloe and Marcus something they clearly needed to learn about the difference between taking advantage of someone and taking them for granted. I put the deed back in its folder but kept the folder out on the dresser, where I could see it. Then I went back downstairs and made myself a proper breakfast, eggs that didn't burn and toast that actually tasted like food. I ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was a small act of rebellion, which in a way it was. I was eating in my own kitchen at my own table without anyone's permission, and that felt like victory enough for now. When I was finished, I washed my dishes and put them away in cupboards that Gerald and I had installed ourselves the summer Marcus turned 16. I wiped down counters that we'd chosen together from a catalog that promised they'd last a lifetime. I straightened dish towels and arranged fruit in the bowl that had been a wedding gift from my mother, gone now for 15 years but still present in the small rituals that made a house a home. Then I sat down with a pen and a piece of my own stationery, the kind with my name embossed at the top in simple black letters, and began to write. Not a response to Chloe's demands, but a list of my own. Things that needed to be clarified, boundaries that needed to be established, and consequences that needed to be understood by everyone involved. At the top of the page, I wrote in my clearest handwriting, house rules for all residents. Below that, I began to outline what life in Velma Stone's house was actually going to look like from now on. Because if Chloe wanted to play games about ownership and authority, I was more than ready to remind her who actually held the deed to this particular playing field. The morning light was still casting rainbows on the kitchen wall when I finished writing, but now they looked less like childhood magic and more like a promise. By Friday, when Chloe expected her first rent payment, she was going to get something very different instead. She was going to get the truth, delivered with all the kindness and consideration she'd shown me. Which was to say, none at all. I folded my list carefully and put it in the same drawer where I'd placed her demands, right next to the deed that proved who really owned this house and everything in it. Then I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled in to wait for my son and his wife to come home, because we were all going to have a conversation that was long overdue. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up to another ordinary Tuesday, but inside the house where I'd raised my children and buried my husband, revolution was brewing in the kitchen that belonged to me and me alone. Chloe had made the mistake of thinking that a grieving widow would be easy to intimidate, that age and loss had made me vulnerable to manipulation and financial abuse. She was about to learn how very wrong she was. The next 3 days passed like a chess game where only I knew all the pieces on the board. Chloe moved through the house with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won, making casual comments about our new arrangement, and asking me sweetly if I'd had time to review the paperwork. Marcus avoided eye contact entirely, hurrying past me in hallways like a guilty child who knew he'd done something wrong but hoped if he moved fast enough, no one would notice. I spent those days doing what Gerald had taught me to do whenever faced with a problem that seemed bigger than I could handle: research, prepare, and gather allies. The first call I made was to Jefferson County Clerk's office, where a bored-sounding woman named Patricia confirmed what I already knew but needed to hear from an official source. The house at 847 Maple Grove Drive was owned solely by Velma Marie Stone, with no other names on the current deed. The quitclaim transfer from Gerald had been properly filed and recorded 3 years ago, making me the undisputed legal owner of every square inch of the property. Is there any possibility of a co-ownership claim from a family member? I asked, keeping my voice casual like I was asking about property taxes. Patricia's laugh was dry and professional. Ma'am, unless someone else's name is on this deed or they've got a court order saying otherwise, you're the only person with any legal claim to that property. Family relationships don't change property law. The second call was to my neighbor Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old retired paralegal who'd lived across the street for 40 years and had a memory like a steel trap when it came to neighborhood gossip. She'd been Gerald's poker buddy's wife and had always been fond of me, especially after I'd helped her when her husband died 2 years ago. Velma, honey, she said when I explained my situation, that girl's been strutting around here like she owns the place since the day she moved in. Last week she had the audacity to tell me my roses were hanging over the property line. I told her I'd cut them when she showed me the survey that proved it. Mrs. Chen had spent 30 years helping lawyers navigate property disputes, and she offered to look over any documents I wanted to show her. More importantly, she had something Chloe didn't know existed, a security camera system that captured most of our driveways and front yards. Been recording everything since those break-ins on Elm Street last year, she said with satisfaction. You'd be amazed what people say and do when they think nobody's watching. The third call was the hardest one to make. I dialed my brother-in-law, Tom, Gerald's younger brother who'd become an estate attorney after serving in the Navy. Tom had handled Gerald's will and the deed transfer, but we'd barely spoken since the funeral. Not because of any bad blood, but because talking to him meant confronting how much I missed Gerald, and some days that grief still felt too heavy to carry in conversation. Velma, Tom's voice was warm but surprised when I explained why I was calling. That little weasel. Gerald specifically set things up so this couldn't happen. He was worried about Marcus's judgment when it came to money and wanted to make sure you'd never be vulnerable. You mean he saw this coming? Tom was quiet for a moment. He saw Marcus struggling with direction, and he definitely had concerns about Chloe's influence. Gerald loved that boy, but he wasn't blind to his weaknesses. He wanted to protect you from having to choose between your security and your relationship with your son. Well, it looks like that choice is being forced. Anyway, Not if I have anything to say about it, Tom said, his voice taking on the edge it used to get when he talked about military strategy. What exactly did this woman threaten you with? I read him Chloe's list word for word, and with each item, Tom's breathing got heavier. By the time I finished, he was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Tom? You still there? I'm here, he said, and his voice was deadly calm. Velma, what she's doing isn't just morally reprehensible. It's potentially criminal. Demanding payment for housing when she has no legal right to the property, threatening eviction when she has no authority to do so, that could constitute extortion depending on how aggressive she gets about it. I don't want to press charges against my son. Marcus isn't the one running this con, and we both know it. But he's going to have to choose which side he's on, because what his wife is doing could land them both in serious legal trouble if she pushes it. Tom offered to drive down from Indianapolis that weekend to help me handle the situation, but I declined. This was something I needed to do myself, in my own way, in my own house. What I asked for instead was advice about the legal boundaries of what I could and couldn't do as the sole property owner. Legally, you can evict them with proper notice, Tom explained. 30 days in Indiana if they're month-to-month tenants, which they probably are since there's no lease. You can also establish house rules as the property owner, including restrictions on guests, noise, common area usage, whatever you want within reason. What about charging them rent? Tom laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him since Gerald's funeral. Velma, you can charge them whatever you want for the privilege of living in your house. Market rate, below market rate, or enough to make them think twice about their life choices. It's your property. And if they refuse to pay? Then you evict them. Family or not, they're adults living in property they don't own. The law doesn't care if they're related to you. After I hung up with Tom, I sat at Gerald's old desk in the corner of the living room and began to draft what I privately thought of as my own household agreement. But unlike Chloe's demand for payment, mine was going to be based on actual legal authority and 30 years of knowing exactly what this house was worth. I started with research, looking up rental prices for similar homes in our neighborhood. 4-bedroom houses with attached garages and finished basements were renting for between $1,800 and $2,200 a month, depending on condition and amenities. My house was in excellent condition, recently updated, and in one of the most desirable school districts in the county. If anything, it was worth more than the average. Then I calculated utilities, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs. For the past year, between the mortgage being paid off and Gerald's life insurance money, I'd been comfortable enough to keep up with everything, but Chloe and Marcus's presence had nearly doubled the electric bill and significantly increased water usage. The grocery bills had tripled, partly because Chloe insisted on buying expensive organic everything and partly because Marcus had reverted to eating like the teenage football player he'd been 20 years ago. When I finished my calculations, I had a number that made my eyebrows raise even though I'd done the math myself. Fair market rent for a house like mine, split between 2 working adults, would be about $1,100 each per month. Add utilities, food, and the premium for living in a house that came with a built-in housekeeper, cook, and caretaker in the form of dear old mom, and they were looking at a total monthly benefit of close to $3,000. I thought about Gerald as I worked, remembering how he used to pay bills at the same desk every month, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose while he carefully entered numbers in the ledger book he kept for household expenses. He'd been methodical about money, never flashy but always fair, and he'd taught me that the most important thing about any financial transaction was that everyone involved understood exactly what they were getting and what they owed. Chloe, apparently, had never learned that lesson. By Thursday evening, I had everything prepared. My own household agreement, printed on the same cream-colored stationery Chloe had used but with significantly different terms. Copies of the deed, the quitclaim transfer, and Tom's business card. A rental market analysis showing comparable properties in the area. And a timeline that gave Marcus and Chloe exactly what they'd given me, until Friday to make a decision about their future living arrangements. Marcus came home from work that evening covered in sawdust and concrete dust, looking tired in the way that came from 10 hours of physical labor in the Indiana heat. He kicked off his work boots by the back door and headed straight for the refrigerator, pulling out a beer and drinking half of it before he noticed me sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of me. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice carefully casual. "What are you working on?" "Just some paperwork," I replied, not looking up from the document I was reviewing. "Where's Chloe?" "Working late again. Big presentation tomorrow or something." He finished his beer and reached for another one, a habit that had started shortly after they moved in and seemed to be getting worse each week. "She said to remind you about Friday." "Oh, I haven't forgotten about Friday," I said, finally looking up at him. In fact, I have something for both of you. Could you ask her to be here tomorrow evening around 6? I'd like to discuss the household situation with both of you together. Something in my tone must have alerted him that this wasn't going to be the conversation he expected, because he set down his beer and really looked at me for the first time in weeks. Mom, are you okay? You seem different. Different. That was one word for it. I'd spent the past 3 days remembering who I was before grief and loneliness made me forget, remembering the woman Gerald had fallen in love with and the mother who'd raised a son to be better than this. I'd spent 72 hours rediscovering my own strength, and apparently it showed. I'm fine, Marcus. Better than I've been in a long time, actually. Just need to clear up some confusion about the house and how things are going to work going forward. He shifted uncomfortably, picking at the label on his beer bottle. Chloe wasn't trying to be mean, you know. She just thinks structure is important. Organization. I'm sure she does, I said evenly. And tomorrow we'll talk about what kind of structure is appropriate for this particular household. Mom, I hope you're not going to make this weird. We're family. That stopped me cold. I set down my pen and looked at my son, really looked at him, trying to find traces of the boy who used to help me fold laundry and tell me about his dreams of building beautiful buildings that would last forever. Marcus, when's the last time you asked me how I was doing? When's the last time you thanked me for cooking dinner or washing your clothes or any of the 100 things I do to make this house run smoothly? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Again. When's the last time you told your wife that disrespecting me in my own home wasn't acceptable? When's the last time you acted like my son instead of her enabler? His face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. That's not fair, Mom. It's complicated. No, Marcus, it's really not. Either you respect me or you don't. Either this is my house or it isn't. Either you're my son who was raised to treat people with dignity, or you're a stranger who thinks he can charge me rent to live in my own home. He set his beer down hard enough that foam spilled onto the counter. Fine. I'll tell Chloe to be here tomorrow. But I hope you're ready to be reasonable about this. Reasonable. There was that word again, the one Chloe had used when she handed me her list of demands. I watched Marcus storm out of the kitchen and heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, the same stairs he used to slide down on Christmas morning when he was small enough to believe in magic and old enough to know that home was the safest place in the world. That night, I went through Gerald's closet one more time, not looking for documents but for strength. I pulled out his favorite shirt, the soft blue flannel he wore for yard work and lazy Sunday mornings, and held it against my face. It still smelled faintly of his cologne and the sawdust that seemed to permanently cling to everything he owned after 40 years in construction. I know you tried to protect me, I whispered into the empty bedroom. I know you saw this coming and did everything you could to make sure I'd be okay. But I think you also knew I'd have to fight for myself eventually. I think you knew I was stronger than I remembered. I folded the shirt carefully and put it back, but I kept one of his ties, a navy blue one with small silver patterns that he'd worn to every important occasion in our marriage. Tomorrow, when I faced down my son and his wife, I wanted something of Gerald's with me, a reminder that love sometimes meant setting boundaries and that protection sometimes looked like holding people accountable for their choices. Friday morning dawned clear and hot, the kind of August day that made the air shimmer above the pavement and sent smart people indoors before noon. I was up early as always, but this time I took extra care with my appearance. I showered and styled my hair, put on the navy dress Gerald had always said brought out my eyes, and clipped on the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. I wasn't dressing up for Chloe or Marcus, I was dressing up for myself, for the woman I'd forgotten I could be when I stopped letting other people define my worth. Chloe left for work before I came downstairs, but not before leaving another note on the kitchen counter reminding me about our agreement and suggesting I could leave the check on the table if I wouldn't be home when she returned. The casual entitlement of it made my jaw clench, but I folded the note calmly and added it to the growing collection of evidence that demonstrated exactly what kind of person my daughter-in-law really was. I spent the day cleaning house, not because it needed it but because I wanted everything to be perfect when we had our conversation. I vacuumed carpets that Gerald and I had picked out together, dusted furniture we'd collected over 3 decades of marriage, and polished the hardwood floors he'd refinished himself the summer before his diagnosis. Every surface I cleaned felt like reclaiming territory, every room I straightened felt like preparing for battle. At 4 o'clock, I set 3 places at the dining room table using the good china that had been my grandmother's, the plates I'd been saving for special occasions that never seemed to come. If we were going to discuss the future of this household, we were going to do it with dignity and proper dishes, not paper plates and plastic forks like some college dorm room negotiation. At 5:30, I arranged my documents in neat piles on the mahogany sideboard Gerald had built himself during his apprenticeship, each stack organized and labeled so there could be no confusion about facts versus feelings. The deed. The rental. Market analysis. Tom's business card. My own household agreement. And at the bottom, like an ace I was holding for the right moment, a copy of Chloe's original demands with my response written in red ink across the bottom. Marcus arrived home at 5:45, earlier than usual and clearly nervous. He'd showered and changed clothes at work, trading his construction gear for khakis and a polo shirt that made him look younger and more uncertain than his 32 years. He hovered in the doorway of the dining room like he was afraid to commit to entering. "Mom, are you sure we need to do this? Can't we just talk it out in the kitchen like normal people?" I looked up from arranging the silverware and gave him a smile that Gerald would have recognized, the one I used to wear when I was about to negotiate a raise at the law firm or convince a stubborn contractor to fix something properly the first time. "Marcus, honey, normal people don't charge their mothers rent to live in their own homes. We stopped being normal people the minute your wife handed me that list." Chloe arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, punctual as always and dressed like she was attending a board meeting rather than a family discussion. Her navy suit was perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless, her hair pulled back in that severe bun that made her look older and more intimidating than her 28 years warranted. She carried herself like a woman who expected to be taken seriously, which was ironic considering she was about to learn exactly how seriously I'd been taking her. "Velma," she said, pausing in the dining room doorway. "This is quite formal. Are we celebrating something?" "In a way," I replied, pulling out my chair at the head of the table where Gerald used to sit. "Please, both of you, have a seat. We have quite a bit to discuss." They exchanged a look as they settled into their chairs, Chloe confident and expectant, Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. I waited until they were both seated before I picked up the first document from my stack, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind them whose house they were sitting in. "Chloe," I began, my voice steady and clear, "earlier this week you presented me with what you called a household financial contribution agreement. You demanded that I pay you $300 a month to live in this house, plus additional fees for utilities and kitchen usage." She nodded, her expression professionally pleasant. "That's right. We thought it was time to formalize everyone's responsibilities." "I see. And this demand was based on your belief that Marcus co-owns this property?" "That's correct. Gerald put the house in both their names when Marcus turned 21. I picked up the deed and placed it on the table between us, turning it so they could both read the header clearly. This is the current deed to this property, filed with Jefferson County 3 years ago. Could you point out Marcus's name on this document?" Chloe leaned forward, her confidence faltering slightly as she scanned the legal language. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush that crept up her neck as she searched for a name that wasn't there. "I don't understand," she said. Finally, Marcus showed me the paperwork. He said his father put the house in both their names. I turned to my son, who was staring at the deed like it might change if he looked hard enough. "Marcus, would you like to explain what paperwork you showed your wife?" His face had gone pale except for 2 bright spots of red on his cheekbones. There was something in Dad's filing cabinet. It looked like. I thought it was. You thought it was what, exactly?" "A deed," he mumbled. "With my name on it." I reached for another document and placed it next to the first one. "This is a quitclaim deed, filed 3 years ago, transferring your father's half of the house to me. It was signed a month before he died, and it makes me the sole legal owner of this property. What you found in his filing cabinet was probably an old draft or a copy of the original mortgage from 1994, when you were 11 years old." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking in the next room. Chloe's professional composure was cracking around the edges, her eyes darting between the documents and Marcus's face like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly changed shape. "But that doesn't change anything," she said finally, her voice higher than before. "Marcus still lives here. He still has rights as your son." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "He does have rights. He has the right to live in his childhood home as long as his mother chooses to let him. He has the right to be treated with love and respect as my son. He has the right to expect that this house will always be a safe place for him to come when he needs support or comfort." Chloe relaxed slightly, thinking she'd found solid ground. "However," I continued, "he does not have the right to charge me rent to live in my own house. He does not have the right to establish rules about when I can use my own living room. And he certainly does not have the right to threaten me with eviction if I don't comply with demands made by someone who has no legal authority whatsoever over this property." I reached for my rental market analysis and spread it across the table like I was dealing cards. "Since you're so interested in formalizing our living arrangement, Chloe, I thought you'd appreciate knowing what market rate would actually be for a house like this. Her eyes widened as she scanned the numbers. $1,800? That's ridiculous. No one pays that much for rent around here. Actually, they do. And that's for a house without the amenities you've been enjoying. Most rental properties don't include a live-in cook, housekeeper, and laundry service. Most landlords don't pay for groceries or utilities or the dozen other expenses I've been covering since you moved in. I pulled out my own household agreement and placed it in front of them, watching Chloe's face as she read the terms I'd outlined in the same precise language she'd used on me. So here's my proposal, I said, settling back in my chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally stopped playing defense. You can continue living in my house under the following conditions. Marcus and Chloe will pay fair market rent of $1,100 each per month, due on the first of every month. They will split utilities equally with the homeowner. They will purchase and prepare their own meals. They will do their own laundry and cleaning. And they will treat the homeowner with the respect due to someone who is both the legal property owner and Marcus's mother. Marcus found his voice first. Mom, we can't afford that. You know we can't. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before trying to charge me $300 to sleep in the bed where your father died, I replied calmly. Or maybe you should consider finding a place you can afford, since you're both employed adults who chose to move back in with family. Chloe had been reading my agreement with growing alarm, her professional facade finally cracking completely. This is insane. You can't just change everything because we hurt your feelings. I'm not changing anything because of hurt feelings, Chloe. I'm correcting a misunderstanding about who owns this house and who has the authority to make demands about rent and household rules. But we're family, Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly on the word. I looked at my son, this man I'd carried and raised and loved unconditionally for 32 years, and felt my heart break just a little bit more. Family doesn't threaten each other with eviction, Marcus. Family doesn't try to turn their mother into a tenant in her own home. Family doesn't stand by silently while someone they love is being emotionally and financially abused. Abused? Chloe's voice rose to a near shriek. No one's abusing anyone. We were just trying to create some structure. You were trying to steal my house, I said flatly. Maybe not legally, since you don't have the brains or the paperwork to pull that off, but you were certainly trying to steal my dignity, my security, and my sense of home. You were trying to make me pay for the privilege of living in the place where I've built every important memory of my adult life. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 64 years in my bones but also feeling stronger than I had since Gerald's funeral. You have until Sunday to decide which of these options you prefer, paying fair market rent as my tenants, or finding somewhere else to live as my former house guests. Either way, the days of treating me like an inconvenience in my own life are over. Chloe shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor Gerald had installed himself 20 years ago. You can't do this. We have nowhere else to go. You had nowhere else to go 6 months ago, which is why I opened my home to you, I replied. But that was an act of love and generosity, not a legal obligation. I'm not required to house two adults who think it's appropriate to threaten and manipulate me. Marcus, Chloe turned to my son with desperation creeping into her voice. Say something. Don't let her do this to us. Marcus looked between his wife and his mother, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of the boy who used to tell me everything and ask my advice about problems both big and small. But then his jaw tightened and he stood up beside his wife, choosing his side in the way that people do when they're too proud to admit they've made a mistake. Fine, Mom. If that's how you want it. But don't expect us to pretend everything's okay between us after this. Everything hasn't been okay between us since you let your wife treat me like hired help in my own house, I replied. At least now we're being honest about it. They left the dining room together, Chloe's heels clicking angrily on the floor and Marcus's heavy footsteps echoing like thunderclaps. I heard them arguing in the kitchen, then more stomping on the stairs, then the slam of their bedroom door that seemed to shake the whole house. I sat alone at the dining room table surrounded by legal documents and good china, feeling the weight of what I'd just done settle around me like a familiar coat. Gerald's tie was still draped around my shoulders where I'd put it that morning. And I touched it gently as I listened to the sounds of my son and his wife fighting upstairs about money and mothers and the reality of actually having to pay for their choices. Tomorrow was Saturday. They had until Sunday to decide whether they wanted to be my tenants or my former house guests. Either way, I was no longer going to be a victim in my own life, and that felt like the kind of victory Gerald would have been proud of. I cleared the table slowly, washing the good china by hand the way my grandmother had taught me, taking care with each piece like it mattered. Because it did matter. Everything mattered now, in ways it hadn't when I was too tired and too sad to remember that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting. Upstairs, the fighting had stopped, replaced by the sound of drawers being opened and closed with unnecessary force. I smiled as I dried my grandmother's plates, because whether they knew it or not, Marcus and Chloe were already packing. And I was finally, after 3 years of grief and 6 months of being made to feel like a stranger in my own life, coming home. Saturday morning arrived with the sound of Chloe's voice carrying through the walls like a siren, sharp and insistent. As she spoke to someone on the phone in their bedroom. I caught fragments through the heating vents that connected our rooms, enough to understand she was calling in favors and exploring options with the desperation of someone who'd just discovered their safety net had holes in it. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen and settled at the table with the newspaper, reading each section thoroughly like I had all the time in the world. Because I did have all the time in the world. This was my house, my kitchen, my morning routine, and for the first time in months, no one was rushing me or making demands or treating me like an inconvenience in my own life. Around 9 o'clock, Marcus appeared in the doorway looking like he hadn't slept much. His hair was sticking up at odd angles and his eyes were rimmed with red, whether from lack of sleep or something stronger, I couldn't tell. He poured himself coffee with hands that shook slightly and sat across from me without making eye contact. "Morning," he mumbled into his cup. "Good morning, sweetheart," I replied, not looking up from the crossword puzzle I was working on. "Sleep well?" He made a noise that wasn't quite a laugh. "Not really. We were up most of the night talking." "About?" "You know what about, Mom. About this whole mess you've created." I set down my pen and looked at him directly, this man who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him and tell me his dreams about building bridges that would connect distant places. "Marcus, the only mess I've created is holding you accountable for trying to financially exploit your own mother. Everything else is just consequences. We weren't exploiting you. We were trying to make things fair." Fair would have been asking me if I needed help with expenses instead of demanding payment for housing you don't own. Fair would have been contributing to household costs instead of adding to them. Fair would have been treating me like family, instead of like a burden you could charge rent to manage. He rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. Gerald used to do the same thing when he was overwhelmed, dragging his palms down his cheeks like he could wipe away whatever was troubling him. "Chloe's parents think we should get our own place," he said finally. "That might be the first sensible thing they've suggested since I've known them." "Mom, come on. You're being unfair. You know we can't afford rent anywhere decent, not with my income and her student loans." I folded the newspaper and set it aside, giving him my full attention. "Marcus, when your father and I got married, we lived in a one-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Patterson's garage for 2 years while we saved for a house. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, and we were proud of it because we were building something together. That was different. Everything was cheaper then. Everything was proportionally cheaper, but we were also making proportionally less money. Your father was making $8 an hour at the construction company, and I was making $5.50 as a secretary. We ate a lot of peanut butter sandwiches and drove cars that broke down more often than they ran, but we didn't expect anyone else to subsidize our choices." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "So what, you want us to live in some dump because we can't afford what you think we should pay?" "I want you to live within your means like every other adult in the world. If that means a smaller place or a longer commute or making sacrifices until you can afford better, then that's what grown-ups do. They don't move in with family and then try to make that family pay for the privilege of housing them. But we're not strangers, Mom. We're your son and daughter-in-law. Which should have made you more considerate of my situation, not less. Which should have made you grateful for my generosity, not entitled to my resources." Chloe's voice drifted down from upstairs, still on the phone, her tone shifting between wheedling and demanding as she worked through what sounded like a list of people who might solve her immediate housing problem. I caught my name several times, along with words like unreasonable and vindictive and impossible to deal with. It was interesting how quickly gratitude turned to resentment when the free ride ended. "She's scared," Marcus said, following my gaze toward the ceiling. "This whole thing has really shaken her up. She should be scared. She tried to defraud a 64-year-old widow and got caught. Fear is an appropriate response to discovering that actions have consequences. She wasn't trying to defraud anyone. She just misunderstood the ownership situation." I leaned back in my chair and studied my son's face, looking for signs of the intelligent, compassionate boy I'd raised. "Marcus, do you honestly believe that? Do you really think your wife's mistake was innocent confusion about property law?" His eyes slid away from mine. "I think she was trying to create some structure in a complicated situation. By demanding that I pay her money to live in my own house? By making sure everyone's responsibilities were clear." "Whose responsibilities, Marcus?" Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like she was trying to make my responsibility to pay her while her responsibility was to. What exactly? Grace me with her presence? Allow me to continue sleeping in the bedroom where I've slept for 30 years? The sound of Chloe's conversation upstairs had taken on a more frantic quality, her voice rising and falling like she was pleading with whoever was on the other end of the line. I heard the word emergency several times, followed by long pauses that suggested the person she was talking to wasn't as sympathetic as she'd hoped they'd be. Look, Mom, I know this got out of hand. Maybe Chloe was too aggressive about the whole thing. But can't we just forget about it and go back to how things were? How things were? I repeated slowly. You mean when your wife treated me like an unwelcome guest in my own home? When she made snide comments about my cooking and my clothes and my life choices? When she acted like I was lucky to be tolerated in the house where I've lived longer than she's been alive? She doesn't mean it personally. That's just how she talks. Marcus, listen to yourself. You're making excuses for someone who tried to extort money from your mother. You're defending behavior that you would never accept from anyone else toward anyone else, but somehow it's okay when it's directed at me. He flinched like I'd slapped him, but he didn't deny it. What do you want me to do, Mom? Leave my wife? Choose between you and her? I want you to be the man your father and I raised you to be. I want you to stand up for what's right instead of going along with what's easy. I want you to remember that love doesn't mean enabling bad behavior, it means caring enough to call it out. Upstairs, a door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows, followed by the sound of Chloe's heels clicking rapidly across the hardwood floor. She appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, her phone still pressed to her ear and her face flushed with anger and frustration. I have to call you back, she said into the phone, then hung up and turned to face us with the expression of someone who'd just been told that all her